the story of late-night television in the 80s, the transformation of the night. There was a time, not so very long ago, when television went to sleep. In the early 1980s, if you found yourself awake at 1 or 2 in the morning, channel surfing in search of something to watch, you would often encounter something that seems almost unimaginable today: silence. Not the silence of a muted television, but the deliberate, programmed silence of a medium that had decided its workday was done. Picture it: the final program of the evening would conclude. Perhaps a movie, perhaps a rerun of some familiar drama, and then, with a kind of ceremonial dignity, the station would prepare to sign off. There was a ritual to this moment, a formal goodbye that acknowledged the end of the broadcast day. The national anthem would play, often accompanied by images of the American flag waving against a blue sky, or a montage of patriotic imagery. For 2 minutes and change, viewers would stand in their living rooms, or at least tradition suggested they should, as the Star-Spangled Banner echoed through the house. It was a moment of collective pause, a reminder that even this electric, ever-present medium had its limits, its boundaries, its need for rest. The anthem served as a bridge between the world of entertainment and the world of sleep, a benediction of sorts, a formal acknowledgement that the day's broadcasting had come to an end. And then, after the final notes faded, you would see it: the test pattern. Perhaps you remember it, that geometric arrangement of lines and circles, the Native American head that appeared on many stations, the Indian head test pattern, a relic from the 1940s that persisted for decades, or sometimes just the stark simplicity of coloured bars. The test pattern served a technical purpose, allowing engineers to calibrate television sets, but for viewers it became a symbol of television's limits, a visual representation of the medium saying, "There's nothing more to see here, go to bed." Or perhaps on some stations there was nothing at all, just static, that hypnotic snow of white noise that filled the screen when there was no signal to receive. If you turned up the volume, you'd hear the gentle hiss and crackle, a sound that some found oddly soothing, a kind of electronic lullaby. The television had gone to sleep, and it expected you to do the same. This was the landscape of early 1980s late-night television. It was smaller, more finite, more structured than what would come later. There were only a handful of channels available to most viewers: the 3 major networks, ABC, CBS and NBC, maybe a local independent station or 2, and PBS if you were lucky. The idea that television could be an all-night companion, a never-sleeping friend in the darkness, was still years away. The medium still observed boundaries, still acknowledged the rhythms of human life that dictated when it was time to rest. There was something almost quaint about this arrangement, something that spoke to an earlier, simpler era. Television, in those days, still saw itself as a guest in your home, one that knew when it was time to leave. It didn't presume to occupy your attention at all hours. It had manners. It knew its place. But even in this more limited landscape, late-night television wielded an outsized cultural influence. With fewer options available, the programs that did occupy those late hours became communal experiences. Everyone who stayed up late was, in essence, watching the same handful of shows, creating a shared cultural vocabulary that would be discussed the next day over coffee and in office break rooms. If you mentioned a particular joke from The Tonight Show or a sketch from Saturday Night Live, there was a good chance your co-workers had seen it too. This monoculture of late-night viewing created a kind of national conversation, a shared experience that's much harder to achieve in our current era of infinite choice. The major networks approached late night with different strategies, different philosophies about what those hours should contain. Each network's approach revealed something about its overall identity and its assumptions about who was watching in those late hours. CBS, for instance, largely avoided the late-night talk show format in these early years. While NBC had Johnny Carson holding court and ABC was experimenting with news programming, CBS filled its late-night hours with something called the CBS Late Movie. This was a more passive offering, a selection of theatrical films and reruns of popular series that required no live studio audience, no celebrity guests, no expensive production apparatus. It was television at its most economical and straightforward. Here's a library of content we own. Let's air it when people might want something to watch, but when we don't want to invest in original programming. The CBS Late Movie became a kind of treasure trove for insomniacs and night owls, offering up a rotating selection of content that might include classic films from various decades or reruns of beloved series that had concluded their primetime runs. The selection was eclectic, almost random at times, as if the programming department had simply reached into their vault and pulled out whatever was available. You might find yourself watching The Avengers, not the Marvel superheroes of today, but the sophisticated British spy series featuring the impeccable John Steed and his various partners in crime fighting. The show had originally aired in the 1960s, and by the early 80s it had achieved a kind of cult status. Patrick Macnee's Steed, with his bowler hat and umbrella that concealed a sword, represented a very particular brand of British cool, and his partnership with Diana Rigg's Emma Peel in the later seasons crackled with intelligence and wit. Watching The Avengers at 1 a.m. felt like discovering a secret, like being let in on something sophisticated and slightly subversive. Or perhaps The Prisoner, that surreal, cerebral drama starring Patrick McGoohan that asked unsettling questions about identity, freedom, and control. The Prisoner was like nothing else on television, a spy series that morphed into something more philosophical and strange, set in a mysterious village where a former secret agent was held captive by forces he couldn't identify or understand. Each episode ended with the same exchange. Who is number 1? You are number 6. It was the kind of show that rewarded late-night viewing, when your mind was loose and receptive to ambiguity and symbolism. On another night, you might encounter Kojak, Telly Savalas's iconic bald detective prowling the streets of New York with a lollipop in his mouth and justice on his mind. Kojak was pure 1970s television, gritty, urban, cynical, but ultimately moral. Savalas had a way of making the character both tough and charming, and his catchphrase, "Who loves ya, baby?" became part of the cultural lexicon. Watching Kojak solve crimes in the middle of the night had a certain appropriateness to it. The show's nocturnal New York setting matched your own late-night viewing experience. These were comfort programs, familiar faces and familiar stories that made the late hours feel less lonely, less strange. There was something reassuring about knowing that if you couldn't sleep, if the worries of the day kept you tossing and turning, you could come downstairs, turn on the television, and find Kojak solving crimes or Emma Peel in her leather catsuit outwitting villains. The content may have been recycled, reruns of shows that had already had their day in the sun, but it served its purpose: companionship in the dark hours. NBC took a different approach on weekend late nights, often relying on special programming that gave those hours a distinct flavor, a sense that weekend late nights were different from weekday late nights, more permissive, more adventurous. The Midnight Special, which had launched in the early 1970s, continued into the early 80s as a showcase for musical performances. The show aired on Friday nights, technically early Saturday mornings, at 1 a.m., and it was an institution for music lovers who wanted to see their favorite artists perform live. It was an eclectic mix, featuring everyone from rock bands to soul singers to comedy acts, all performing in a setting that felt more intimate and adventurous than primetime variety shows. What made the Midnight Special special was its willingness to book acts that might not get primetime exposure. You might see mainstream artists like the Bee Gees or Olivia Newton-John, but you might also see punk bands, new wave acts, or soul singers who didn't fit the wholesome mold of primetime variety shows. The show had a looseness, a sense that anything could happen that matched the late-night time slot. And because it aired at 1 a.m., after most parents had gone to bed, teenagers could sneak downstairs and watch performances that felt dangerous and exciting in a way that primetime content never could. The weekend late night was a space for experimentation, for programming that might not fit elsewhere in the schedule. Networks seemed to understand that weekend late night viewers were different, younger maybe, or at least in a different frame of mind. They weren't winding down from a workday, they were extending the weekend, refusing to let it end, staying up as an act of rebellion against the approaching Monday morning. And then there was PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service, which occupied its own unique space in the television landscape. PBS stations weren't typically counted in discussions of national late-night schedules, and for good reason. Member stations had tremendous local flexibility in what they aired and when. Unlike the commercial networks, which had strict affiliate agreements that dictated what stations aired at specific times, PBS operated on a more decentralized model. The network would provide programming, but local stations could air it whenever they chose, or not air it at all if they preferred something else. This meant that PBS late night was a kind of wild card, impossible to predict, but often rewarding for those who sought it out. In one city, the PBS station might be showing a British mystery series at midnight, perhaps an episode of Mystery, hosted by Vincent Price, featuring adaptations of Agatha Christie or Dorothy Sayers. In another city, it might be airing a documentary about marine biology, those Jacques Cousteau specials that combined scientific information with stunning underwater cinematography. Or perhaps a recorded symphony performance, the camera panning across the orchestra as they worked through Beethoven or Mahler. PBS late night had a particular aesthetic, intellectual, cultural, slightly European in sensibility. It was programming for viewers who wanted something more substantial than entertainment, who saw television as a medium for education and enlightenment, as much as for distraction. There was something wonderfully unpredictable about it, the sense that you never quite knew what you might find if you turned to your local PBS station at midnight. This was the landscape, smaller, yes, but structured. Finite, but influential. A world where late night had clear boundaries, where certain hours belonged to entertainment and others to silence, where the test pattern marked the end of the broadcast day, as surely as the sunset marked the end of daylight. But it was a landscape on the verge of transformation. Even as this traditional structure held sway, forces were gathering that would transform late night into something altogether different. And surprisingly, one of the most significant of these forces wasn't entertainment at all. It was news. The transformation began with a crisis halfway around the world. In November 1979, Iranian militants stormed the US Embassy in Tehran and took American citizens hostage. 52 Americans were held captive, and the crisis would drag on for 444 days, dominating news coverage and national consciousness. It was a shocking event, one that captivated and horrified the nation, and it seemed to demand more attention than the traditional evening newscast could provide. ABC News, under the leadership of Roone Arledge, began providing regular late-night updates on the crisis. These weren't just brief bulletins, they were substantial reports, 15 or 20 minutes of in-depth coverage that extended ABC's evening news programming into the late-night hours. The updates were initially just extensions of the regular newscast, but they quickly evolved into their own entity, a program called America Held Hostage, anchored by State Department correspondent Ted Koppel and ABC News's Frank Reynolds. Night after night, Americans tuned in to America Held Hostage to learn the latest developments. Had there been progress in negotiations? Were the hostages well? What was happening behind the scenes? The program became a ritual, a way of staying connected to an ongoing crisis that seemed to have no resolution in sight. When the hostage crisis finally ended in January 1981, the hostages were released on the very day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president, a final gesture of contempt from the Iranian government toward Jimmy Carter. ABC faced a decision. The nightly updates had built a dedicated audience, people who had grown accustomed to getting in-depth news coverage in that late-night time slot. Rather than simply abandoning that audience, ABC made a bold choice. They would transform America Held Hostage into a permanent program, one that would cover not just single ongoing crises, but any important news story that merited deeper examination. The program was renamed Nightline, and Ted Koppel became its sole anchor. It debuted on March 24, 1981, and it represented something genuinely new in television, a late-night news program that wasn't just headlines and summaries, but substantive journalism, investigative reporting, and in-depth interviews. Ted Koppel was the perfect choice for this venture. With his measured delivery, his probing questions, and his refusal to settle for easy answers, Koppel brought a gravitas to late night that had rarely been seen there before. He had a distinctive style, formal without being stuffy, intelligent without being condescending, persistent without being rude. When Koppel interviewed a politician or expert, you knew he had done his homework. He asked follow-up questions. He challenged evasions. He didn't let people hide behind talking points. Nightline wasn't just headlines read aloud. It was substantive journalism, long-form interviews, serious discussions about complex topics. A typical episode might feature a 20-minute interview with a world leader, or a deep dive into a policy issue that the evening news could only touch on briefly. It was the news equivalent of an in-depth magazine article, and it found its home in the late-night hours when viewers might have time to engage with more nuanced, detailed coverage. The program had a distinctive format. Usually there would be a brief introduction to the topic, perhaps some background reporting, and then Koppel would conduct interviews, often via satellite with multiple guests in different locations. The technology of satellite interviews was still relatively new and exciting in the early 1980s, and Nightline made extensive use of it. creating conversations between people on different continents, bringing together perspectives that might never have been combined otherwise. By 1982, Nightline had expanded to air 5 nights a week, cementing its place in the late-night landscape. ABC scheduled it at 11:30 p.m., right after local news, positioning it as a natural continuation of the evening's information programming. For viewers who wanted more than entertainment in their late hours, who craved substance and insight, Nightline became appointment viewing. It was the thinking person's late-night program, the show you watched when you wanted to understand the world, rather than just be distracted from it. The success of Nightline sent ripples through the television industry. If hard news could work in late night, what other assumptions about that time period needed to be reconsidered? Late night had always been seen as a realm of entertainment, a time when viewers wanted to unwind and relax, not engage with serious topics. But Nightline proved that assumption wrong. There was an audience for serious content late at night, people who wanted to go to bed informed rather than merely entertained. NBC was watching, and in July 1982, the network launched NBC News Overnight, the first major overnight network news program. This was an ambitious experiment, a recognition that there were viewers awake at all hours who might want news coverage. The program aired from 1:30 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. on weeknights, truly overnight hours when most of America was asleep. NBC News Overnight was anchored by Linda Ellaby and Lloyd Dobbins, 2 journalists with distinctive styles and personalities. Ellaby, in particular, brought a conversational, sometimes wry tone to the proceedings. She seemed to understand that overnight viewers were a different breed, that they didn't need the formality and stiffness of traditional newscasts. The program mixed hard news with lighter features, creating a gentler, more varied tone. You might get a serious report on international affairs, followed by a quirky human interest story about an eccentric inventor or an unusual hobby. The show acknowledged that overnight viewers might be insomniacs seeking distraction, shift workers on their breaks, or simply night owls who wanted to know what was happening in the world. It had a warmth to it, a sense that the anchors understood they were keeping you company in the lonely hours. Ellaby would sometimes address the audience directly, acknowledging the strangeness of being awake at 2 a.m., creating a sense of camaraderie with viewers. The program had its charms, anchors who spoke in more conversational tones, features that might not fit in prime-time newscasts, a recognition that overnight viewing was different from daytime or evening viewing. There were segments about books, about technology, about cultural trends. It felt less like a traditional newscast and more like a smart magazine show that happened to include news. But it was expensive to produce. News programming always is. You need reporters, camera crews, editors, producers, all working overnight shifts that require premium pay. And the audience, while dedicated, was small. The ratings couldn't justify the costs. In 1983, just a year after its launch, NBC made the difficult decision to cancel NBC News Overnight. The audience was there, but it wasn't large enough to justify the expense. Linda Ellaby famously signed off the final episode with her trademark phrase, "And so it goes." There was a poignancy to it, a recognition that good television doesn't always survive the business realities of the medium. CBS, meanwhile, had launched its own entry into late-night news, CBS News Night Watch, in October 1982. This program took a different approach from both Nightline and NBC News Overnight. one that acknowledged the reality of how news was consumed across the country and how television stations actually operated. Nightwatch aired from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., providing coverage throughout the overnight hours. But rather than being a continuous network program, it was designed to be modular. Local CBS affiliates could insert their own updates, their own local news segments, creating a hybrid of national and local coverage. This flexibility was important because different stations had different needs. A station in New York might want more extensive local coverage, while a small market station in the Midwest might prefer to air more network content. The program was anchored initially by Christopher Glenn and later by various other journalists. It had a more straightforward, traditional news format than NBC News Overnight, fewer features, more straight reporting. But it served a purpose, providing information for overnight workers, insomniacs, and early risers who wanted to know what had happened while they slept. Nightwatch would survive longer than NBC News Overnight, running until 1992, proof that there was indeed an audience for overnight news, even if it was a niche audience. The expansion of news programming in late night also became crucial during major events. Elections, international crises, natural disasters. These were moments when the networks extended their late-night coverage, sometimes staying on the air all night to provide continuous updates. Late night became a space where the nation could gather during moments of collective anxiety or celebration, where information could flow freely in the hours when sleep seemed impossible anyway. During presidential elections, the networks would provide coverage well into the early morning hours as results came in from different time zones. Viewers would stay up, watching state by state as the electoral map filled in, drinking coffee and waiting to see who would win. These were communal experiences, moments when being awake late at night meant being part of something larger, a national vigil for democracy. Similarly, during international crises, wars, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, the networks would abandon their regular late-night schedules and provide continuous news coverage. The normal boundaries dissolved. Entertainment programming was preempted. The medium reverted to its essential function, providing information during times when information mattered most. This shift represented something profound. Late night was no longer just the domain of entertainment. It had become a space where serious matters could be discussed, where journalism could thrive, where the day's events could be processed and analyzed. The traditional sign-off was beginning to seem quaint, even irresponsible. How could television go silent when the world continued to turn? How could broadcasters send viewers to bed when news was still breaking, when events were still unfolding? The answer increasingly was that they couldn't, and they wouldn't. Yet even as news carved out its space in the late-night hours, the traditional talk show remained the beating heart of late-night television, and at the center of that universe, constant as the North Star, was Johnny Carson. The Tonight Show. Starring Johnny Carson was more than just a program. It was an institution, a cultural touchstone, the place where America went to unwind at the end of the day. Carson had been hosting since October 1st, 1962, and by the 1980s, he had refined his craft to the point of near perfection. The monologue, the desk pieces, the interviews, the comedy sketches, Carson made it all look effortless, natural, as comfortable as conversation with an old friend. But beneath that easygoing exterior was real power. An appearance on The Tonight Show could make a career. This wasn't hyperbole or exaggeration. It was simple fact. confirmed by dozens of comedians whose lives changed after a successful Tonight Show set. The show reached millions of viewers every night, and Carson's approval carried enormous weight. If Johnny laughed at your jokes, America would too. If he invited you to sit on the couch after your stand-up set, you were on your way to stardom. Comedians would speak in reverent, almost religious tones about getting the nod from Carson. That moment when, after their stand-up set, Johnny would gesture them over to the couch. The couch was sacred ground. Not every comedian got invited to sit there after their first appearance. Some did their set and were thanked, and that was it. But if Carson liked you, if he thought you had something special, he'd wave you over, and suddenly you were sitting next to the most powerful person in late-night television, trading jokes and stories, being welcomed into the club. That invitation meant everything. It meant Carson saw potential in you. It meant he was willing to put his stamp of approval on your career. And that stamp was pure gold. Booking agents would be calling the next day. Comedy club owners would want you for their venues. Other talk shows would come calling. Your fee would go up. Your career trajectory would change in an instant. The dynamic was almost feudal in nature. Carson was the king, and appearing on his show was like being granted an audience. He could make careers, and, though he rarely did this overtly, he could also break them. If Carson turned against you, if he mocked you in his monologue or made it clear he didn't find you funny, it could be devastating. The industry paid attention to Carson's opinions, and so did America. But Carson wore his power lightly. He was self-deprecating, quick to laugh at himself, generous with other performers. He seemed genuinely delighted when a comedian did well on his show, and his laugh, that distinctive cackle, was authentic, not forced or faked for the camera. You could tell when Carson was genuinely enjoying something, and that authenticity was part of his appeal. The 1980s late-night talk show wars that would be discussed in hushed, dramatic tones were really just variations on a single theme: how to compete with Johnny Carson's dominance. Other networks tried different strategies, different hosts, different formats, but Carson remained the benchmark, the standard against which all others were measured. He was simply the best at what he did, and he'd been doing it longer than anyone else. Carson's ratings in the early 1980s were phenomenal. He regularly pulled in 10 to 12 million viewers per night, sometimes more. For comparison, that's roughly equivalent to what a successful primetime program might get today, except Carson was doing it 5 nights a week at 11:30 p.m. His audience was enormous, loyal, and demographically desirable. Advertisers loved The Tonight Show because it reached educated, affluent viewers who had disposable income. The show had a formula, but within that formula was tremendous variety. The monologue would address the day's news, usually political jokes mixed with pop culture references and observations about everyday life. Carson's monologue delivery was impeccable. He knew how to build to a punchline, how to recover from a joke that didn't land. He'd make a face or a comment that was often funnier than the original joke. How to read the audience and adjust his pacing accordingly. After the monologue came the desk pieces, comedy bits that Carson would perform from behind his desk. These might be sketches with the show's regulars, Ed McMahon, Doc Severinsen, Tommy Newsom, or they might be characters Carson played: Karnak the Magnificent, the psychic who could divine the question before hearing the answer; Art Fern, the sleazy host of the Tea Time movie; or Aunt Blabby, Carson in drag as a cranky old woman. These characters became beloved institutions in themselves, eagerly anticipated by regular viewers. Then came the guests, usually a mix of celebrities promoting their latest project, authors discussing their books, and comedians doing stand-up. Carson was a skilled interviewer, able to draw out interesting stories from his guests, but he also knew when to let a funny guest run with an anecdote. He had impeccable timing, knowing when to jump in with a quip and when to stay silent and let the guest have the moment. The show also featured animal experts like Joan Embury from the San Diego Zoo, who would bring exotic animals onto the show. These segments were pure entertainment. Carson interacting nervously with pythons or baby elephants or exotic birds, often with hilarious results. The unpredictability of live animals on a live show created genuine moments of chaos and laughter. And throughout it all, there was the music, provided by Doc Severinsen and the NBC Orchestra. Severinsen, with his colourful suits and his virtuoso trumpet playing, was an essential part of The Tonight Show's appeal. The music underscored everything, punctuated jokes, provided transitions, and occasionally took centre stage when a musical guest performed. This was the template, the formula that had been refined over 2 decades. It worked because Carson made it work, because he brought intelligence and charm and genuine curiosity to the proceedings every single night. And then, in 1982, something interesting happened. NBC, Carson's own network, decided to program something after The Tonight Show in the 12:30 a.m. slot that had previously been occupied by Tomorrow with Tom Snyder. They chose a young, gap-toothed comedian from Indianapolis named David Letterman. Late Night with David Letterman debuted on February 1st, 1982, and from its first episode, it was clear this was something different, something that had never quite existed on television before. Where Carson was smooth and polished, the consummate professional who made everything look easy, Letterman was awkward and self-conscious, constantly drawing attention to the artificiality of the talk show format. Where Carson made comedy look effortless, Letterman seemed to be struggling with the very format of the talk show, questioning its conventions, exposing its absurdities. He brought a sensibility that was entirely new to Late Night, a kind of knowing wink at the audience, an acknowledgement that we were all in on the joke together. Letterman's humour was postmodern, before most people knew what that word meant. He would make jokes about the show's low budget, about the fact that they were on at 12:30 a.m. when most people were asleep, about the absurdity of having celebrity guests on to promote projects that had already been promoted everywhere else. He treated the conventions of the talk show as something to be played with, deconstructed, mocked affectionately. The show's aesthetic was deliberately cheap, almost public access in its lo-fi approach. While The Tonight Show looked slick and professional, Late Night looked like it was held together with duct tape and good intentions. This wasn't a bug. It was a feature. The show's scrappy underdog quality was part of its charm. Letterman introduced segments that became legendary, bits that would be imitated and referenced for decades to come. There was stupid pet tricks, where ordinary people brought their animals to do mildly amusing things, a dog that could howl the national anthem, a cat that played dead, a parrot that did impressions. It was simultaneously a celebration of the mundane and a parody of television's tendency to present the ordinary as extraordinary. Stupid human tricks followed the same formula, with people demonstrating weird talents. Someone who could drink milk and squirt it out of their tear ducts, someone who could balance dozens of spoons on their face, someone who could make unusual sounds with their mouth. It was vaudeville for the postmodern age, a recognition that there was something inherently absurd about watching people do pointless tricks on television, but also something delightfully human about it. Then there were the top 10 lists, which started as a parody of rankings and countdowns, but became a cultural phenomenon in their own right. Each night, Letterman would present a top 10 list on some topic. Top 10 signs your neighbor is a spy. Top 10 things never said by Jimmy Carter. Top 10 failed advertising slogans. The lists were a mix of clever wordplay, pop culture references, and absurdist humor. They became so popular that they would eventually be spun off into books and calendars. But Letterman's genius extended beyond the specific segments. It was in the overall approach, the willingness to take risks, to fail publicly, to do things that had never been done on television before. He dropped watermelons off the roof of the building to watch them explode. He drove a car through a wall of glass. He sent his cameras outside to follow random passers-by on the street. He created a sense that anything could happen. That late night was a space for experimentation and play. One of the show's most famous recurring segments was Will It Float, in which objects would be dropped into a tank of water to see if they would sink or float. The segment was completely pointless, which was exactly the point. It was a commentary on television's need to fill time, on the audience's willingness to watch anything, on the absurdity of the entire enterprise. Letterman also interacted with his staff in ways that were unusual for talk shows. Larry Bud Melman, actually Calvert DeForest, a senior citizen who became a recurring presence on the show, was presented as a sort of anti-celebrity, someone who had no particular talent or reason to be on television, except that Letterman found him amusing. The relationship between Dave and his band leader, Paul Shaffer, was central to the show's dynamic. Shaffer would egg Dave on, laugh at his jokes, provide musical stings that commented on what was happening. What Letterman understood, perhaps instinctively, was that the post-midnight audience was different from the 11:30 audience. They were younger, more alert. Paradoxically, despite the late hour, the people still awake were committed night owls, not just people gradually winding down, more willing to embrace the absurd and unconventional. They didn't need the comforting familiarity of Carson's format. They wanted surprise, edge, unpredictability. Yet even as Letterman carved out his own identity, he was still operating in Carson's shadow, still part of the NBC late-night empire. Carson himself had been one of Letterman's champions, had helped him get the late-night slot. There was a lineage there, a passing of the torch, even though the torch was being used to light entirely different kinds of fires. The variety-style late-night program, with its mix of interviews, sketches, and music, remained the template. Carson had established the form, and everyone else was working variations on it, but Letterman had shown that there was room within that form for innovation, for pushing boundaries, for questioning assumptions. But the landscape was shifting, becoming more crowded, more competitive. The monopoly of the 3 networks was beginning to crack. New voices were emerging, challenging the established order in ways both subtle and dramatic. NBC's Saturday Night Live had entered the 1980s in a state of crisis. The original not ready for prime time players, the legendary cast that had included John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, Gilda Radner, Bill Murray, and others, had largely departed. The show's creator, Lorne Michaels, had left in 1980, exhausted after 5 years of producing live television every week. The show was now being produced by Jean Doumanian, and it was struggling to find its footing. The 1980 to 81 season, sometimes called SNL 80, was widely considered a disaster. The new cast lacked chemistry, the writing was uneven, the whole enterprise seemed to have lost the anarchic energy that had made the show essential viewing in its first 5 years. Ratings plummeted, critics savaged it. There was serious talk that NBC might cancel Saturday Night Live altogether, that the experiment that had seemed so revolutionary in 1975 might not survive into the new decade. But NBC decided to give the show one more chance. They brought in a new producer, Dick Ebersol, and empowered him to rebuild from the ground up. Ebersol made wholesale changes, keeping only a few cast members from the previous season and bringing in new talent. Among the new cast members was a young comedian from New York named Eddie Murphy. Murphy had been a cast member during the troubled 1980 to 81 season, but he'd been underutilized, given little to do. Ebersol recognized Murphy's potential and made him the centerpiece of the revamped show. Murphy was a revelation, brash, energetic, fearless, capable of creating characters that were both hilarious and somehow real. His impersonations were uncanny. Stevie Wonder, hosting a parody of That's Incredible and participating in ridiculous stunts because he couldn't see the danger. James Brown, singing about celebrity hot tubs. Gumby, the clay animation character reimagined as a cigar-chomping showbiz veteran, demanding, "I'm Gumby, damn it." Murphy's original characters became instant classics. Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood, a parody of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood set in an urban ghetto, was edgy and satirical, while somehow maintaining affection for its subject. Buckwheat, an adult version of the Little Rascals character, appeared in various sketches including the famous Bar Wheat Sings bit, and Velvet Jones, a sleazy pitchman selling books with titles like I Wanna Be a Hoe, pushed boundaries in ways that seemed shocking even in the more permissive atmosphere of late-night television. Alongside Murphy was Joe Piscopo, who did brilliant impressions of Frank Sinatra, and whose partnership with Murphy created some of the era's most memorable sketches. Together, Murphy and Piscopo essentially saved Saturday Night Live. They gave audiences a reason to stay up late on Saturday nights, to see what these two talented performers would do next. Murphy's success on SNL demonstrated something important. Late night could be a launching pad for major stardom. He would go on to become one of the biggest movie stars of the 1980s, Trading Places, Beverly Hills Cop, Coming to America. But it was those late Saturday nights, those live performances broadcast from Studio 8H in Rockefeller Center, that introduced him to America and established his persona. Saturday Night Live, under Ebersol's leadership, regained its cultural relevance. It was no longer the cutting-edge phenomenon it had been in its first years, but it was solid, professional, capable of producing moments of genuine brilliance. It proved that late-night comedy could survive personnel changes, creative upheaval, even periods of serious decline. And then in 1986, something unprecedented happened. A woman became the host of a network late-night talk show. Joan Rivers, who had been a frequent guest host on The Tonight Show and had built her own successful career as a stand-up comedian, was chosen by the fledgling Fox network to host The Late Show starring Joan Rivers. This was groundbreaking on multiple levels. Not only was Rivers the first woman to host a network late-night talk show, a barrier that remarkably had never been broken in the 3 decades of late-night television, But she was doing it on Fox, a new network that was attempting to challenge the dominance of ABC, CBS, and NBC. Fox had launched in October 1986, initially with just a few hours of programming per week. The network was the brainchild of media mogul Rupert Murdoch, who had purchased 20th Century Fox and several television stations, and was now attempting to build a fourth broadcast network from scratch. It was an audacious plan, one that many industry observers thought would fail. The last time someone had tried to launch a fourth network, Dumont, back in the 1950s, it had collapsed within a few years. But Fox saw late night as a way to distinguish itself, to show that it could compete with the established networks. If they could land a big-name host and create buzz, they could get people to tune in, to remember that Fox existed, to think of it as a real network rather than just a collection of independent stations. Joan Rivers was a logical choice. She was well known, having appeared on The Tonight Show more than 100 times over the years. She was funny, quick-witted, unafraid to push boundaries. She had guest-hosted for Carson frequently, demonstrating that she could handle the format, and she was willing to take a chance on an unproven network. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers debuted on October 9, 1986, with Elton John as the first guest. The show had a big budget, a prominent time slot, 11 p.m. directly opposite Carson, and high expectations. Rivers brought her own sensibility to the format. She was more gossipy than Carson, more willing to dish about celebrity scandals, more emotional and confessional in her comedy. But Rivers' move to Fox came at a personal cost. Johnny Carson, who had been a mentor and champion of Rivers' career, felt betrayed by her decision to compete against him. The breach was deep and painful. Carson never spoke to Rivers again. When she tried to reach out, tried to explain, he refused to take her calls. It was one of the most famous feuds in television history, and it never healed. Carson died in 2005 without ever reconciling with Rivers. The rift revealed something about the nature of late-night television. For all its humor and entertainment, it was also a business, one where loyalties were tested and relationships strained by competition and ambition. Carson had helped Rivers, had given her opportunities, and in his view, she had repaid him by becoming his direct competitor. From Rivers' perspective, she had every right to accept Fox's offer, to advance her own career, to take a chance on hosting her own show. Both perspectives were valid, but they were irreconcilable. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers struggled from the beginning. Fox didn't have enough affiliates to reach all markets, which limited the potential audience. The show's tone seemed uncertain, trying to be both glamorous and edgy, both mainstream and alternative. Behind the scenes, there were creative conflicts between Rivers and the network. After less than a year, Fox fired Rivers and replaced her with a series of guest hosts before eventually cancelling the show altogether. But despite its failure, The Late Show starring Joan Rivers was significant. It proved that a woman could host a late-night talk show, even if the industry wouldn't give another woman that opportunity for many more years. It showed that Fox was serious about competing with the established networks, that they were willing to invest in high-profile programming, and it demonstrated that late night was now a battleground, a space where networks would compete aggressively for viewers and cultural influence. Fox's venture into late night was part of a broader transformation. The network was using unconventional programming to establish its identity. Edgy sitcoms like Married with Children, reality shows, sports programming, and late night was a key part of that strategy. The traditional three-network oligopoly was breaking down, and late night was one of the battlegrounds where this struggle played out. Meanwhile, other voices were gaining national attention. Arsenio Hall, a young comedian and actor, had been gaining recognition through stand-up performances and acting roles. He filled in as a guest host on various programs, demonstrating a relaxed, engaging style that connected particularly well with younger audiences. Hall represented a new generation of performers who had grown up watching Carson, but who brought their own sensibilities, their own cultural references, their own vision of what late night could be. Late night was increasingly showcasing stand-up comedians, recognizing that the format was particularly well suited to their talents. The monologue was essentially a stand-up set. The desk pieces were extensions of a comedian's persona. The interviews allowed comedians to be themselves, to riff and joke with guests. Late night provided a platform for comedians to reach millions of viewers, to build their careers, to establish themselves as personalities beyond just their stand-up material. Cable channels, particularly HBO, were experimenting with uncensored stand-up specials that couldn't have aired on broadcast television. Comedians like George Carlin, Richard Pryor, and Robin Williams were doing hour-long specials that pushed boundaries, used profanity, addressed controversial topics. This created an interesting dynamic. Late night was becoming both more diverse and more fragmented. You could watch polished, network-friendly comedy on NBC or ABC, or you could turn to cable for edgier, more provocative material. The audience was beginning to splinter, to seek out content that matched their particular tastes. HBO's comedy specials were particularly significant because they demonstrated that there was an appetite for comedy that didn't have to conform to broadcast standards. Comedians could be themselves, could use the language and address the topics that worked in their club acts. The specials were often taped late at night, creating a sense of intimacy and transgression, of watching something you maybe shouldn't be watching. This fragmentation of the late-night audience would only accelerate in the years to come, but in the mid-1980s, it was just beginning. The monopoly was cracking. The assumption that everyone should be watching the same thing was breaking down. Late night was becoming more diverse, more competitive, more willing to take risks. And speaking of cable, no discussion of 1980s late-night television would be complete without acknowledging the seismic impact of MTV. On August 1st, 1981, at 12:01 a.m., MTV, music television, launched with the words, "Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll," followed by the Buggles, "Video killed the radio star." It was a prophetic choice, because MTV was about to transform not just music, but the entire concept of what television could be. MTV was revolutionary for a simple reason. It never stopped. It was 24 hours of programming, 7 days a week. There were no sign-offs, no test patterns, no national anthem at midnight. The very concept of television signing off became instantly obsolete. If you were awake at 3 a.m., MTV was there with you, playing music videos in an endless stream, a constant flow of images and sound that never paused, never took a breath, never acknowledged that there might be a time when television should rest. This was genuinely radical. Before MTV, the idea of 24-hour television existed only in limited forms. News services like CNN, which had launched in 1980, or religious broadcasting. But MTV brought 24-hour programming to youth culture, to popular music, to entertainment. And in doing so, it fundamentally changed what people expected from television. For teenagers and young adults in the 1980s, MTV became the soundtrack and visual vocabulary of their lives. You would come home from school and turn on MTV. It would be playing in the background as you did homework, as you talked on the phone, as you got ready to go out. It was ambient entertainment, something that didn't require focused attention, but that was always there, providing a constant stream of music and images. Music videos weren't just promotional tools anymore. They were art forms, mini-movies that combined music, fashion, narrative, and visual experimentation. Directors like Russell Mulcahy, Steve Barron, and Kevin Godley brought cinematic techniques to music videos, creating little visual gems that were analyzed and discussed as seriously as any short film. Michael Jackson's Thriller, which premiered in 1983, was a 14-minute mini-movie directed by John Landis. It had a budget of $500,000, astronomical for a music video at the time, and featured elaborate choreography, special effects makeup, and a narrative structure. It was an event, something that transcended the typical music video and became a cultural phenomenon. MTV played it constantly, and viewers would watch it over and over, memorizing the dance moves, marveling at the production values. Madonna's videos, Like a Virgin, Material Girl, Vogue, were equally significant, combining provocative imagery with fashion-forward aesthetics and narrative complexity. Madonna understood that MTV was a visual medium, and she crafted her image accordingly, using each video to reinvent herself, to push boundaries, to create conversation and controversy. MTV's VJs, video jockeys who introduced the videos and provided commentary, became celebrities in their own right. Martha Quinn, Mark Goodman, Nina Blackwood, Alan Hunter, and J.J. Jackson were the original VJs, and they brought personality and context to the music, creating a sense that MTV was a community, a place where people who loved music could gather. Shows like 120 Minutes, which focused on alternative and college rock, became appointment viewing for fans of non-mainstream music. The show aired late on Sunday nights, actually early Monday mornings, from midnight to 2 a.m., and it was a lifeline for people whose musical tastes didn't align with Top 40 radio. You could discover new bands, see videos that never got played during regular MTV hours, feel connected to a subculture. Various countdown programs, MTV's Top 20 Video Countdown, Dial MTV, became rituals, shaping musical tastes and creating shared cultural experiences. People would call in to vote for their favorite videos, creating an interactive element that was novel for its time. MTV normalized the idea of television running all night. It demonstrated that there was an audience for overnight programming, that people didn't necessarily go to sleep when prime time ended. This had profound implications for the broader television landscape. If MTV could run 24 hours a day, why couldn't other channels? The answer, of course, was that they could, and increasingly they would. The growth of basic cable meant that viewers suddenly had more options for late-night viewing than ever before. Cable channels offered movies, American movie classics, Turner Classic Movies, though TCM wouldn't launch until 1994. Channels showing old movies proliferated in the 80s. USA Network showed reruns of classic television series. Nickelodeon, which was primarily a children's channel during the day, would eventually start showing Nick at night in the evenings, a block of classic sitcoms aimed at adults who had grown up watching these shows. Some local stations programmed low-budget creature feature blocks, showing horror and science fiction films hosted by colourful personalities who would crack jokes and introduce the movies with theatrical flair. These hosts became local celebrities, Zachary in New York, Vampira, and later Elvira on the West Coast, and dozens of others across the country. Each had their own persona, their own shtick, but they all served the same function, making late-night movie viewing into a communal experience, a party where the host was your guide through the strange and campy world of B-movies. Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, was perhaps the most famous of these hosts. Played by Cassandra Peterson, Elvira was a horror host with a Valley Girl accent, a revealing black dress, and a seemingly inexhaustible supply of terrible puns. Elvira's movie Macabre became a cult phenomenon, and Elvira herself became a pop culture icon, appearing in movies, commercials, and various other media. These hosts understood something important. Late-night viewing was different from prime-time viewing. The audience was smaller, but more engaged, more willing to embrace camp and cheese, more appreciative of the host's personality. You weren't just watching a bad horror movie, you were watching a bad horror movie with a friend who made it fun. Syndicated talk and variety programs became more common, often featuring hosts who couldn't land network slots, but could find audiences in syndication. These shows might air at different times in different markets, but they filled the late-night hours with conversation and entertainment. Some were barely disguised infomercials. Others were legitimate talk shows with celebrity guests and musical performances. The landscape was expanding, becoming richer and more diverse. Late night was no longer a finite resource controlled by a handful of gatekeepers. It was becoming a vast, varied ecosystem where different kinds of programming could find their niches, where viewers could seek out content that matched their specific interests. This expansion coincided with another technological revolution that would transform how people consumed late-night television. The VCRs, video cassette recorders, had existed since the 1970s, but they had been expensive luxury items. By the early 1980s, prices were dropping, and VCRs were becoming standard household appliances. By the mid-1980s, more than half of American households owned one. By the end of the decade, VCR ownership was nearly ubiquitous. As VCR ownership spread throughout the 1980s, from luxury item to standard household appliance, viewers gained the ability to time-shift their viewing. Couldn't stay up for The Tonight Show? Record it and watch it the next day. Want to catch Saturday Night Live but have other plans? Set the timer and watch it Sunday morning. The tyranny of the schedule was broken. This seems unremarkable now, in an era of DVRs and streaming services where we can watch anything anytime, but at the time, it was genuinely revolutionary. For the first time in television history, viewers had control over when they consumed content. You didn't have to organize your life around the television schedule. You could organize the television schedule around your life. The VCR transformed late-night viewing in particular ways. For one thing, it meant that late-night programs could be watched at more convenient times. A parent with young children who couldn't stay up until midnight to watch a talk show could record it and watch it during the baby's nap time the next day. A college student who wanted to watch Saturday Night Live but had a party to attend could record it and watch it Sunday with friends, laughing together at the previous night's sketches. This time shifting created interesting questions about what late-night television even meant. If you were watching The Tonight Show at 2 p.m., was it still late-night programming? The content hadn't changed, but the context had. Part of the appeal of late-night television had always been its temporality, the sense that you were staying up late, participating in something that happened in the dark hours. Watching it the next day was different, removed from that context. But the VCR also enabled new ways of engaging with late-night content. You could rewatch your favorite segments, pause during particularly funny moments, fast forward through interviews with guests you didn't care about. You could build libraries of late-night shows, taping them night after night and creating personal archives. Some people became obsessive collectors, filling shelves with VHS tapes labeled Tonight Show, Eddie Murphy, Letterman, 1984, SNL, Eddie Murphy hosts. The economics of late night were also changing in ways that reflected its growing importance. Advertising in late night slots was significantly cheaper than prime time, which made it attractive to certain types of advertisers. Direct response ads, those commercials that urged you to call now or operators are standing by, became increasingly common in late-night hours. These ads had a particular aesthetic, usually low budget, often featuring enthusiastic hosts demonstrating products with exaggerated claims about their benefits. The Ginsu knife commercials were classics of the genre. But wait, there's more, became a catchphrase. The knife could slice through a tin can and still cut a tomato. It could saw through a piece of rope. And if you ordered now, you'd get not one, but 2 sets of knives, plus a bonus vegetable peeler, all for just $19.95. Or the Ronco products, pitched by the legendary Ron Popeil, the inside-the-shell egg scrambler, the pocket fisherman, the veg-o-matic. Popeil had a gift for demonstration, for making products seem simultaneously ridiculous and essential. His commercials were entertaining in their own right, and they became part of the late-night landscape, as familiar as the programs they interrupted. Early infomercial-style spots began to appear, lengthy commercials that resembled programs, blurring the line between advertising and content. These would become much more prevalent in the 1990s, but their origins were in the late-night hours of the 1980s. Some sold kitchen gadgets or cleaning products, but others sold record collections, compilations of hits from the 50s or 60s, complete with testimonials from people exclaiming how much they loved these songs. The best of the 60s, the announcer would proclaim, as the screen filled with album covers and brief clips of songs. 36 original hits by the original artists. Songs you remember, songs you love. And then would come the list, scrolling up the screen as snippets of music played. The Beach Boys, the Supremes, the Four Tops, the Temptations. The offer would seem impossibly good. All these songs, on cassette or CD, for just $29.95, plus shipping and handling. These commercials became part of the late-night experience, a signal that you had entered a different realm of television, one with different rules and different expectations. There was something oddly comforting about them, these low-budget appeals that acknowledged you were awake when most people slept, that spoke directly to insomniacs and night owls, that offered solutions to problems you didn't know you had. The traditional late-night block, that structured progression from local news to talk shows to sign off, was beginning to stretch and expand like taffy pulled in different directions. What had once ended at 1 a.m. was now extending into the early morning hours. Some stations stayed on the air until 2 a.m., then 3 a.m., then later still. The boundaries were becoming porous, indefinite, harder to define. As the 1980s drew to a close, the transformation of late-night television could be clearly seen in how network schedules had evolved, how the landscape had shifted, how the very nature of the medium had changed. In the 1980 to 81 season, NBC's late-night lineup had been relatively straightforward. Local news at 11 p.m., then The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson at 11:30, followed by The Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder at 1 a.m. It was a neat progression, each program serving a distinct purpose, leading viewers from the news of the day through entertainment and conversation before signing off around 2 a.m. Tom Snyder's Tomorrow Show was itself an interesting piece of late-night history. Snyder was a different kind of host, intense, confrontational sometimes, genuinely curious about his guests. The show had a stripped-down aesthetic, just Snyder and his guest talking in a dimly lit studio, smoke from Snyder's ever-present cigarette curling up toward the lights. It was intimate television, the kind of conversation that felt appropriate for 1 a.m., when the world had quieted and there was space for real talk. But by 1982, Tomorrow was gone, replaced by Letterman's Late Night. That change symbolized a broader shift in late-night programming, away from serious conversation toward comedy, irony, experimentation. By the end of the decade, everything had changed. Late-night television had evolved into a more crowded, more competitive ecosystem. Multiple networks were programming late-night talk shows. Cable channels were offering 24-hour alternatives. MTV with its endless music videos, CNN with its continuous news coverage, USA Network with its movies and reruns. News programming had claimed its space in the late hours, with Nightline providing substantive journalism at 11:30 and CBS's Night Watch covering the overnight hours. The neat boundaries had dissolved. No longer was there a clear endpoint to the broadcast day, a moment when television acknowledged that its work was done and it was time for rest. Instead, there was a continuum, programming bleeding from prime time into late night, into overnight, into early morning, an endless stream that never truly stopped. The era of sign-offs and test patterns and static was fading into memory, becoming something that older viewers would remember with a certain nostalgia, the simplicity of it, the way it marked the end of the day with ceremonial finality, the national anthem playing as the flag waved on screen. There had been something reassuring about that ritual, something that acknowledged the rhythms of human life, the need for rest, the importance of boundaries between work and sleep, between day and night. But for younger viewers, the idea that television would simply stop seemed absurd, almost quaint. Why would it stop when there were still people awake? Still people who wanted entertainment or information or companionship? Why would television sign off when the world continued to turn, when events continued to unfold, when there were stories to tell and jokes to make and music to play? Late night was becoming a 24-hour continuum, an endless stream of programming that acknowledged the reality of modern life. Not everyone sleeps at the same time, not everyone lives on the same schedule, and the world doesn't pause for rest. Shift workers coming home at 2 a.m. wanted something to watch. Insomniacs needed company at 4 a.m. Parents with newborns up for the third time in a night were grateful for anything that made the lonely hours feel less lonely. This transformation had profound implications that would only become fully apparent in the decades to come. The idea that there were shared media experiences, that everyone was watching the same things at the same time, was beginning to fragment. With more choices available, audiences were splitting into smaller groups, each seeking content that matched their particular interests and schedules. No longer did everyone at the office gather around the water cooler to discuss last night's episode of a show, because not everyone had watched it. Maybe you'd watched it live. Maybe you'd recorded it and watched it this morning. Maybe you'd watched something else entirely on one of the cable channels. The monoculture of 3-network television was cracking, and late night was one of the places where those cracks were most visible. Yet even in this increasingly diverse landscape, certain programs retained their cultural power. Johnny Carson was still Johnny Carson, still the king of late night, still the person whose approval could make or break a career. His ratings remained strong, his influence undiminished. When Carson told a joke about a political figure, it could shape public perception. When he welcomed a young comedian, it could launch a career. The Tonight Show remained the gold standard, the program against which all others were measured. Saturday Night Live, despite its ups and downs, its cast changes and creative upheavals, remained a cultural institution, a place where comedy and music and politics intersected in ways that felt immediate and vital. People still talked about SNL sketches on Monday mornings, still debated which cast member was funniest, still watched to see who was hosting and which musical guest would perform. Nightline had proven that serious journalism could thrive in late night, that there was an audience for substantive news coverage in hours that had traditionally been devoted to entertainment. Ted Koppel had become one of the most respected journalists in America, and his program had become essential viewing during moments of crisis or significant news events. The foundation had been laid for everything that would come later: the explosion of cable channels in the 1990s, the fragmentation of audiences into ever smaller niches, the eventual streaming revolution that would make the very concept of late-night television almost meaningless. In the streaming era, there would be no late night, because there would be no schedule at all, just an infinite library of content available whenever you wanted it. But in the 1980s, that future was still years away. The transformation was still underway, still incomplete. Late night was expanding, experimenting, discovering what it could be beyond the traditional formats that had defined it for decades. The screen was staying lit later and later. The static was disappearing. The test patterns were fading from memory like dreams upon waking. Television was learning to stay awake, teaching itself new tricks, finding new voices, discovering new audiences. And in doing so, it was fundamentally changing what it meant to be a viewer in the modern world. No longer were you bound by the schedule, forced to watch what the networks decided to air when they decided to air it. With cable and VCRs, you had choices. You had control. You could seek out the content you wanted, whenever you wanted it. The night was no longer empty, no longer silent. It was full of voices, full of images, full of possibilities. It was alive with Johnny Carson's laughter and David Letterman's irony, with MTV's music videos and CNN's news reports, with old movies on cable and infomercials selling miraculous knives, with Saturday Night Live's anarchic comedy and Nightline's serious journalism. And somewhere, in cities and towns across America, people were awake to experience it all, finding companionship and entertainment in those late hours, part of a growing community of night owls who had discovered that television, like the city itself, never truly sleeps. They might be college students procrastinating on term papers, watching Letterman while pretending to study. They might be parents with colicky babies, pacing the floor at 3 a.m. while MTV played music videos in the background. They might be insomniacs, grateful for the company of familiar voices, for Johnny's jokes and Dave's pranks, and Ted's serious questions. They might be shift workers, nurses and factory workers, and security guards, coming home in the small hours to find television still awake and waiting for them. The revolution was quiet, gradual, almost imperceptible. It didn't happen all at once with some dramatic announcement or technological breakthrough. It happened slowly, incrementally, through 1,000 small decisions and changes. A network deciding to extend its programming by an hour. A cable channel choosing to broadcast 24 hours a day. A local station deciding not to sign off at midnight, but to stay on until 2 a.m., showing old movies. But it was real, and it was reshaping the relationship between viewers and the medium that had become such an integral part of daily life. Television was no longer just something you watched in the evening, during prime time, with the family gathered around. It was becoming a constant companion, a 24-hour presence, something that was always there when you needed it. Late night would never be the same again. The boundaries had been crossed, the barriers broken down, the old rituals abandoned. Television had learned to stay awake, and in learning that lesson, it had transformed itself into something new, something that would continue evolving in the decades to come. The test pattern was fading, the national anthem falling silent, the static disappearing into memory. In their place was a world of infinite programming, endless choices, constant stimulation. The night belonged to television now, and television belonged to everyone who was awake to watch it. The transformation of late-night television in the 1980s wasn't just about what appeared on screen. It was about something deeper, something more fundamental. A shift in how Americans related to television itself, how they thought about time, how they structured their days and nights. For generations, television had been a daylight medium, or at most an evening one. It was something that happened during specific hours, that had a beginning and an end, that respected the natural rhythms of human life. You woke up, you went about your day, and in the evening you might turn on the television to watch the news or a favorite program, and then at a certain hour, television would go to sleep, and you would too. This arrangement reflected a particular worldview, one that valued boundaries and structure, that believed in clear demarcations between work and leisure, between wakefulness and sleep, between day and night. Television, in this framework, was a guest in your home, a welcome guest to be sure, but one that knew when to leave. But the 1980s challenged all of that. The decade saw the rise of a 24-hour society, one that never fully slept, where shift work became more common, where global business meant someone was always working somewhere, where the old 9-to-5 structure began to feel increasingly obsolete, and television evolved to match this new reality. The change happened gradually enough that many people didn't fully notice it at the time. A station that used to sign off at midnight started staying on until 1, then 2. Then it stopped signing off altogether. Cable channels launched that had never known what a sign-off was, that had been designed from the beginning to run continuously. VCRs made it possible to watch programs at any time, decoupling content from its scheduled time slot. Each of these changes seemed small, incremental, almost trivial. But together, they represented a fundamental reimagining of what television could be and what role it could play in people's lives. Consider the experience of a typical viewer in 1980 versus 1989. In 1980, if you were awake at 2 in the morning and turned on your television, you would most likely find static or a test pattern on most channels. Your options were severely limited. Perhaps a movie on one channel, perhaps nothing at all. The message was clear. You should be asleep. Television has gone to bed, and so should you. By 1989, that same viewer would find a radically different landscape. MTV would be playing music videos, CNN would be broadcasting news, multiple cable channels would be showing movies or reruns. Maybe a local station would be airing an old sitcom or a talk show from earlier in the evening. The options weren't infinite, but they were substantial. And the message had changed. Whatever your reason for being awake, television is here for you. This shift had psychological implications that went beyond mere entertainment options. For people who worked night shifts, nurses, factory workers, police officers, security guards, television's expansion into the overnight hours provided a sense of connection to the broader culture. When you came home at 3 in the morning from a 12-hour shift, exhausted and wired at the same time, it was comforting to find that television was still awake, still offering company and distraction. For insomniacs, chronic or occasional, the expansion of late-night television was similarly meaningful. Insomnia can be a profoundly isolating experience. You lie awake while the world sleeps, feeling disconnected from everyone else, alone with your thoughts and anxieties. But if you could turn on the television and find programming, not just static, but actual shows, actual content, it made the lonely hours feel less lonely. You weren't the only one awake. Somewhere a talk show host was making jokes. Somewhere a VJ was introducing a music video. Somewhere a news anchor was reading the latest developments. You were part of something, even at 3 in the morning. Parents with newborns discovered this too. Those first months with a baby often involve a lot of overnight wakefulness, feedings at midnight, at 2, at 4 in the morning. Having something to watch during those sessions, some distraction from the exhaustion and the monotony, made those long nights more bearable. You could nurse your baby while watching an old movie on cable, or rock them to sleep while Letterman did something absurd with Velcro. The expansion of late-night television also created new spaces for niche programming, content that might not have survived in the more competitive prime-time hours, but could thrive in the overnight landscape. Religious broadcasting found a home in late-night hours, as did infomercials, as did reruns of cult shows that had never found mainstream success, but had devoted followings. Local stations discovered that late-night hours could be filled inexpensively with syndicated content, old sitcoms, drama series from decades past, movies that they'd acquired the rights to air. These weren't high-quality productions or prestigious programs, but they served a purpose. They filled time. They gave viewers something to watch, and sometimes in the process, they introduced younger viewers to shows from before their time. A teenager in 1985, channel surfing at midnight, might stumble upon reruns of The Twilight Zone from the late 1950s and early 1960s. Rod Serling's introductions, with their philosophical musings and moral warnings, felt particularly appropriate for late-night viewing. The show's themes, alienation, paranoia, the uncanny intrusion of the extraordinary into ordinary life, resonated differently at midnight than they would have at 8 in the evening. There was something dreamlike about watching the twilight zone in the small hours, as if you had entered your own twilight zone, a space between waking and sleeping, where the normal rules didn't quite apply. Or maybe they'd find Star Trek, the original series, with its earnest utopianism and its colourful 1960s aesthetic. Watching Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock explore strange new worlds at 1 in the morning had its own charm, a kind of temporal dislocation where you were watching a 1960s vision of the future from the vantage point of the 1980s in the middle of the night. The layers of time and mediation created a strange, pleasant vertigo. These serendipitous discoveries were one of the joys of late-night television in the 1980s. With fewer channels than we have today, but more than in previous decades, there was still the possibility of stumbling onto something unexpected, something you hadn't planned to watch but that captured your attention. You might turn on the television looking for one thing and find something else entirely, something that became a new favourite, or at least a pleasant way to pass an hour. The aesthetics of late-night television programming were distinctive too. Because the audiences were smaller and the advertising revenue lower, there was less pressure for programs to be polished and mainstream. Late night could be weird, it could be experimental, it could take risks that prime-time programming couldn't justify. This was particularly true of public access television, which existed in many cities and often had its late-night hours filled with truly bizarre content. Public access channels were required by law in many cable systems, giving ordinary citizens the ability to produce and air their own programs. The result was a wonderfully chaotic mix of community announcements, local talk shows, political screeds, artistic experiments, and content that defied easy categorization. In New York, public access late night meant shows like The Uncle Floyd Show, a deliberately low-budget variety program hosted by Floyd Vivino that had started on local broadcast television but found a second life on cable. The show was simultaneously a parody of children's television and a genuine variety show featuring puppets, sketches, and musical performances. It had a cult following of people who appreciated its homemade aesthetic and surreal humour. Or there was Midnight Blue, hosted by Al Goldstein, a pornographer and free speech advocate who used his public access show to rail against censorship, review adult films, and interview sex workers and adult industry figures. The show was deliberately provocative, pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable on television. It could only have existed on public access, in late-night hours, where the normal gatekeepers of broadcast standards had no authority. In other cities, public access late night featured shows that were equally strange. Performance artists doing experimental pieces that made no concession to mainstream taste, local musicians playing in someone's basement, political activists presenting their manifestos directly to the camera. The production values were often terrible, bad lighting, worse sound, shaky camera work, but there was a raw energy to it, a sense that television could be truly democratic, that anyone could have a voice. This was a vision of television that has largely disappeared in our current era of professionally produced content and algorithm-curated streams. Public access late night was the Wild West, unpredictable and often unwatchable but occasionally brilliant, always authentic. It represented a kind of television that existed outside the commercial system, that didn't need to attract millions of viewers or satisfy advertisers. It just needed to exist, to put something out into the world for whoever might be watching. The expansion of late-night programming also changed the economics of television production. Shows that might have had modest success in prime time could be rerun late at night, extending their value and their cultural life. A drama series that had aired on primetime network television in the 1970s might find a second audience in syndication in the 1980s, airing at midnight on local stations or cable channels. This created interesting dynamics for actors and creators. A show that had been cancelled after a few seasons might become a cult favorite through late-night reruns, leading to renewed interest and sometimes even revivals or reunion specials. Star Trek was the most famous example of this phenomenon. The original series had been cancelled in 1969 after just 3 seasons, but it found enormous popularity in syndication throughout the 1970s and 80s, airing late at night and building a devoted fan base that would eventually lead to movies, spin-off series, and a multi-billion-dollar franchise. Late-night reruns could also introduce shows to entirely new audiences. Someone too young to have watched a series during its original run might discover it years later, watching reruns at midnight while home from college on summer break. The temporal dislocation added another layer. You were watching a show from another era, seeing how people dressed and talked and thought about the world in a different time, all while experiencing it in the context of your own present moment. This created a kind of dialogue between past and present, a conversation across time mediated by television. A show like Mass H, which had dealt with the Korean War but was really about Vietnam and the social upheavals of the 1960s and 70s, took on new resonances when watched in the 1980s. The distance allowed for both nostalgia and critical perspective, a recognition of how much had changed and how much remained the same. The technology of television itself was evolving during this period in ways that enhanced the late-night viewing experience. Remote controls, which had been luxury items in the 1970s, became standard equipment in the 1980s. This seems like a small thing, but it fundamentally changed how people watch television. Before remote controls, changing the channel meant getting up from your seat, walking to the television, and manually turning a dial. This created a certain commitment to whatever you were watching. You might sit through a commercial break or a dull segment because the effort of getting up to change the channel wasn't worth it. With a remote control, channel surfing became possible. You could flip between channels with minimal effort, sampling different programs, avoiding commercials, creating your own customized viewing experience. This was particularly valuable late at night, when programming was more varied and less predictable. You might surf between a movie on one channel, a talk show on another, music videos on MTV, news on CNN, creating a kind of collage of content. This style of viewing, fragmented, non-linear, self-directed, was a preview of how we would consume media in the digital age. The remote control was the first tool that gave viewers real agency in constructing their own experience, and late night was the perfect time to exercise that agency. The sound of late-night television was distinctive too. If you were watching alone late at night, you probably had the volume turned down low so as not to disturb others who were sleeping. This created an intimate relationship with the television, requiring focused attention to hear the dialogue or catch the jokes. The television became a companion that spoke to you in hushed tones, a confidant sharing secrets in the darkness. Or maybe you were wearing headphones, a practice that became more common as headphone technology improved and became more affordable. Watching television with headphones created a completely immersive experience, shutting out the rest of the world and creating a private space where only you and the television existed. The voices of talk show hosts, the music from MTV, the dialogue from movies, all of it piped directly into your ears, creating an intimacy that was different from watching with speakers. There was something transgressive about late-night viewing too, especially for younger viewers. If you were a teenager or college student living at home, staying up late to watch television felt like getting away with something. Your parents were asleep. You had the house to yourself, or at least the living room. You could watch whatever you wanted without oversight or judgment. This was particularly significant for content that might not have been approved during family viewing hours. MTV's music videos could be provocative, with sexual imagery and themes that wouldn't have been appropriate for prime-time broadcast television. Late-night talk shows might feature comedians doing material that was edgier than what they'd do earlier in the evening. Saturday Night Live, airing at 11:30 p.m., could push boundaries in ways that prime-time sketch comedy couldn't. There was a sense that late night belonged to you, to the people who were awake while the rest of the world slept. It was a space for content that was more adult, more sophisticated, more willing to take risks. The smaller audience meant less pressure to appeal to the broadest possible demographic, which paradoxically allowed for programming that was more interesting, more specific, more willing to cultivate niche audiences. This dynamic would become even more pronounced in the decades to come as cable channels proliferated and the fragmentation of the audience accelerated. But in the 1980s, it was just beginning, and late night was one of the primary spaces where it played out. The physical experience of late-night viewing was also distinctive. If you were watching in a darkened room, the television became the primary source of light, its glow illuminating your face and casting shadows around the room. There was something slightly hypnotic about this, the way the flickering images commanded your attention, the way the rest of the room faded into darkness. The coolness of late night, the temperature dropping, the house settling, the ambient sounds of the neighborhood quieting, created a sensory environment that was different from daytime viewing. You might be wrapped in a blanket on the couch, comfortable and drowsy but not quite ready to sleep. Or you might be wide awake, energized by the night, finding that your mind worked differently in these hours than it did during the day. Different people had different reasons for being awake late at night, and television accommodated all of them. Some were intentionally staying up, making a deliberate choice to extend the day, to squeeze more waking hours out of the 24 available. Others were awake against their will, struggling with insomnia or anxiety, finding that sleep wouldn't come no matter how tired they felt. Still others were working, taking a break from a night shift or studying for an exam, using television as a brief respite from their obligations. And some were in liminal states, too tired to be fully alert but too wired to sleep, existing in that strange space between waking and sleeping where consciousness becomes fluid and malleable. Late-night television was perfectly suited to these liminal states, requiring just enough attention to keep you engaged, but not so much that it demanded full alertness. The content itself sometimes seemed to acknowledge this liminal quality. Late-night talk shows had a dreamlike quality to them, especially if you were watching in a drowsy state. The conversation would wash over you, snippets of jokes and anecdotes creating a kind of audio collage. You might drift off for a moment and wake to find the guest had changed, or the show had ended and something else had begun, creating a disorienting but not unpleasant sense of temporal discontinuity. Music videos on MTV had a similar quality. Each video was its own little world, 3 or 4 minutes of images and sound that told a story or created a mood, and then it was over and another one began. You could watch for hours in a kind of trance state, absorbing the imagery without necessarily processing it consciously, letting the music and visuals create an emotional landscape that shifted with each new video. Even commercials took on a different character late at night. The hard sell of daytime advertising gave way to something stranger and more hypnotic. Those direct response ads with their repeated phone numbers and their promises of transformation, "Call now, operators are standing by," became mantras, the repetition creating a kind of rhythm. The infomercials, with their extended demonstrations and their testimonials from satisfied customers, had a meditative quality if you watched them in the right frame of mind. There was a whole ecosystem of late-night advertising that existed nowhere else, products that were marketed specifically to people who were awake at odd hours. Some of these were legitimate: kitchen gadgets, exercise equipment, music compilations. Others were more dubious: miracle weight loss pills, psychic hotlines, get-rich-quick schemes. But all of them shared a certain aesthetic, a recognition that late-night viewers were a special audience with their own needs and vulnerabilities. The psychic hotline commercials were particularly notable. "Call Miss Cleo," the ads would urge, promising that a psychic could provide insights into your love life, your career, your future. The commercials featured testimonials from people who claimed the psychics had changed their lives, interspersed with images of tarot cards and crystal balls. The whole enterprise was probably fraudulent, but the commercials themselves were fascinating cultural artifacts, revealing something about the anxieties and desires of late-night viewers. Who calls a psychic hotline at 2 a.m? Someone who's lonely, probably. Someone who's worried about something and can't sleep. Someone who's looking for answers or reassurance or just human connection, even if it comes in the form of a paid phone call to a stranger claiming supernatural abilities. The existence of these commercials, their proliferation in late-night hours, suggested that there was a market for this kind of service, that enough people were feeling isolated and uncertain in the small hours that it was worth advertising to them. Similarly, the ads for chat lines, phone services where you could talk to strangers, ostensibly for dating purposes, proliferated in late-night hours. "Meet someone special tonight," the ads promised, showing attractive people laughing and having what appeared to be meaningful conversations. The subtext was clear. If you're awake and alone right now, there are other people awake and alone too, and maybe you could connect with them. These ads, like the psychic hotlines, were playing on the loneliness and isolation that could accompany late-night wakefulness. They offered a solution, albeit a commercial one, to the problem of being awake when the rest of the world slept. Whether the services actually delivered on their promises was secondary to the fact that they recognized a need and attempted to address it. The late-night viewing experience was also shaped by what wasn't on television. In the early 1980s, there were still hours when most channels had nothing to offer, when you really would find static or test patterns if you turned on the TV late enough. This scarcity gave a certain value to the programming that did exist. If there was only one channel showing something watchable at 3 a.m, you watched that channel. You didn't have the luxury of being choosy. By the late 1980s, this was changing. Cable had expanded the options considerably, but there was still a finiteness to it, a sense that the choices, while greater than before, were not infinite. You could flip through all the available channels in a minute or two and know what your options were. This was very different from our current era of streaming, where the choices are so vast that decision paralysis can set in. The limited options of late-night 1980s television actually created a different kind of freedom. You couldn't spend an hour scrolling through menus trying to decide what to watch. You looked at what was available, picked something, and committed to it. And often this led to watching things you wouldn't have chosen if you'd had more options, which in turn led to unexpected discoveries and pleasures. You might think you wanted to watch a movie, but the only movie on was a Western from the 1950s, a genre you'd never particularly liked. So you watched it, and maybe you discovered that you actually enjoyed Westerns, or at least this particular Western. Or maybe it confirmed that you didn't like Westerns, but at least you'd spent an hour engaged with something, rather than endlessly searching for the perfect option. This acceptance of limitation, this willingness to engage with what was available rather than endlessly seeking the ideal, is something that has largely disappeared from our media consumption. The abundance of choice in our current era is in many ways wonderful, but it has also made us more impatient, more demanding, less willing to give something a chance if it doesn't immediately grab us. Late-night television in the 1980s, with its limited but growing options, occupied a sweet spot between the extreme scarcity of earlier decades and the overwhelming abundance that would come later. There was enough variety to provide genuine choice, but not so much that the act of choosing became paralyzing. As the 1980s drew to a close and the 1990s approached, it was becoming clear that late-night television had fundamentally changed. What had begun the decade as a relatively small, structured landscape, a few talk shows, some news programming, movies and reruns filling the gaps before the inevitable sign-off, had transformed into something vastly more complex and varied. The sign-off itself had become an anachronism, a relic of an earlier era that now seemed quaint and outdated. Why would television stop broadcasting when there were people awake to watch it? Why would stations play the national anthem and display a test pattern when they could be showing content, generating revenue, serving audiences? The economic logic was compelling. Even if overnight audiences were small, they were still audiences. Advertisers might pay less for late-night and overnight spots, but they would pay something. And the cost of keeping a station on the air, particularly if you were just running syndicated reruns or old movies, was relatively low. The math worked out. It made sense to stay on. But the transformation went beyond mere economics. It reflected a deeper shift in how Americans lived their lives, how they structured their time, how they thought about the relationship between day and night, work and leisure, public and private. The traditional industrial schedule, everyone working roughly the same hours, everyone sleeping roughly the same hours, was breaking down. The service economy was growing, and service work often happened outside the traditional 9-to-5 framework. Restaurants stayed open later. Stores extended their hours. Customer service call centers operated around the clock. The notion of a normal schedule was becoming less universal, less assumed. And as people's schedules became more varied, more individualized, they needed media that could accommodate that variety. If you worked until midnight, you needed something to watch when you got home at 12:30. If you couldn't sleep at 3 in the morning, you needed company, distraction, something to occupy your mind until exhaustion finally overtook you. Television, which had once dictated to viewers when they could watch and what they could see, was learning to be more flexible, more accommodating, more responsive to the actual rhythms of people's lives. The VCR accelerated this shift by decoupling content from schedule entirely. For the first time, you could watch what you wanted when you wanted, at least within the limits of what you had recorded. This seems unremarkable now, but it represented a genuine revolution in the relationship between viewers and the medium. Television had always been a live medium, or at least it had been experienced as such. Even reruns, even movies that had been filmed years earlier, were experienced in the moment of their broadcast. You watched them when they aired, or you didn't watch them at all. The VCR changed that, introducing the possibility of time shifting, of storing time itself in magnetic tape and playing it back at your convenience. This had profound implications for late-night programming in particular. The Tonight Show, Saturday Night Live, Nightline, these could all be recorded and watched the next day, or the next week, or whenever was convenient. The temporal specificity that had been essential to late-night television, the sense that you were watching something in its proper time, began to erode. Yet something was lost in this process too. Watching The Tonight Show at noon the next day was not the same as watching it at 11:35 at night. The context was different. The mood was different. The sense of participation in a shared cultural moment, millions of people across the country watching Johnny Carson at the same time, was diminished when you watched it hours or days later. This tension between liveness and time shifting, between shared cultural experiences and individualized consumption, would only intensify in the decades to come. The 1980s were the beginning of this transformation, the moment when the old model started to crack, but hadn't yet completely broken down. Cable television and MTV in particular represented another kind of transformation, the shift from scheduled programming to flow, from discrete programs with clear beginnings and endings to continuous streams of content that never really stopped. MTV didn't have shows in the traditional sense. It had blocks of music videos, interrupted occasionally by VJs or special programs, but fundamentally operating as an endless flow. This model anticipated how we would consume media in the digital age, not as discrete units, but as streams, flows, algorithms generating endless content tailored to our preferences. But in the 1980s, it was new and exciting, this idea that television could just keep going, that there didn't need to be clear boundaries between programs or clear stopping points in the broadcast day. The late-night landscape of the 1980s, then, was a transitional space, caught between the old model of limited, scheduled, communal viewing and the new model of abundant, on-demand, individualized consumption. It contained elements of both, creating a unique viewing experience that can't be replicated today. For those who experienced it, late-night television in the 1980s carries a particular nostalgia. It was the last era when television still had mystery, when you might genuinely not know what was on, when stumbling across something unexpected was a regular occurrence. It was an era when television still observed some boundaries, still acknowledged human limitations, but was learning to push past them. The people who stayed up late in those years, the insomniacs and shift workers, the students cramming for exams and the parents with newborns, the night owls who simply felt more alive after midnight. They formed a kind of community, connected not by geography or demographics, but by their shared experience of being awake when most people slept. They watched Johnny Carson make jokes about the day's news. They saw David Letterman drop watermelons off buildings. They discovered new music on MTV, new perspectives on Nightline, new or old shows in syndication. They bought products from infomercials they would never have considered in daylight. They called psychic hotlines, seeking answers to questions they couldn't articulate. And through it all, the television glowed in the darkness, a companion, a distraction, a window into the wider world. It kept them company in the lonely hours. It made the night feel less empty, less isolating, less strange. By the end of the 1980s, late-night television had established itself as an essential part of the medium, no longer an afterthought or a marginal concern, but a significant piece of the television landscape. The innovations and experiments of the decade, the expansion of news into late hours, the diversification of talk show formats, the rise of cable and MTV, the introduction of time-shifting technology, had laid the groundwork for everything that would come after. The 1990s would see further expansion and fragmentation. More talk shows would emerge, competing for the audiences that Carson and Letterman had cultivated. Cable would continue to grow, adding hundreds of channels and creating ever more specialized programming. The internet would begin its slow transformation of media consumption, introducing new possibilities and challenges. But the 1980s were the crucial turning point, the decade when late-night television evolved from a limited afterthought into a vibrant, diverse, essential part of the television ecosystem. It was the decade when the sign-off began its long fade into obsolescence, when the test pattern became a relic, when television learned to stay awake through the night. For those who were there, who experienced it firsthand, the memory of that transformation carries a particular quality, the sense of having witnessed something significant, having participated in a cultural shift that would reshape how we consume media and structure our time. And for those who weren't there, who know late-night television only in its current form, fragmented across hundreds of channels, available on demand through streaming services, divorced from any particular time of day, the 1980s late-night landscape might seem impossibly limited, quaintly constrained. But within those constraints was a kind of magic, a sense of possibility and discovery that's harder to find in our current era of abundance. There was something special about staying up late, flipping through the limited channels available, finding something unexpected, committing to it, letting it fill those dark hours with light and sound and companionship. The night doesn't belong to silence anymore. It belongs to television, to media, to the endless stream of content that never stops flowing. That transformation began in earnest in the 1980s, in those late hours when the old rules were breaking down and new ones were being written. And if you listen carefully, in the quiet moments between programs, you can almost still hear the echo of that national anthem, the one that used to play before the static, before the test pattern, before the screen went dark. It's a ghost now, a memory of a time when television knew when to say goodnight. But memories fade, and the screen stays lit, and the night goes on, filled with voices and music and stories, an endless conversation that never quite reaches a conclusion, that never quite says goodbye. The transformation is complete. Television has learned to stay awake, and we, the viewers, have learned to expect it, to rely on it, to organize our lives around its constant presence. Late night is no longer late, it's just night, and night, like television itself, never ends. It simply continues, flowing forward into the hours that follow, into the days and years ahead, an endless stream of light in the darkness, a companion for anyone who finds themselves awake when the rest of the world sleeps. And so the story of late-night television in the 1980s, is really the story of how we learned to live with a medium that never rests, that never signs off, that's always there when we need it, or think we do. It's a story without a clear ending, because the transformation it describes is ongoing, still unfolding, still reshaping how we relate to media and time and each other. But it's a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth drifting off to sleep while listening to, a gentle reminder of how things used to be, how they changed, and what we gained and lost in the transformation. The night belongs to television now, and television belongs to the night, and both belong to us, the viewers, the watchers, the people who refuse to let the darkness go unwitnessed, who fill the empty hours with light and sound, who find comfort in the glow of the screen. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere, television is still awake, still broadcasting, still keeping watch through the long night. And when you wake, it will still be there, faithful as ever, ready to fill whatever hours you give it with stories and music and voices that make the world feel a little less lonely, a little less vast, a little more like home. Good night.